notion of the autonomous self, free from the contamination of the social, is dead. Kincheloe, 2005, page 45. Hello, Internet. In the last episode, we talked about Chapter 1 of Joe Kincheloe's 2005 book, Critical Constructivism. Today, I'll do my best to quickly summarize what we've learned so far before jumping into Chapter 2. And, by the way, we're only going to cover half of Chapter 2 today for reasons I'll explain in Chapter 2, Part 2, in the next episode. To summarize Chapter 1. At its most fundamental level, critical constructivism argues that our world is entirely made up in our minds. We build the world in our heads because we cannot access reality. We cannot access an objective, real world because that world passes through the filter of our minds. The reality you think of when you hear the word reality is a constructed reality, a product of our consciousness. But we are not all world builders. We are not all equally able to build the world because some of us have been alienated from our creative and social nature. Alienated from being able to build the world that is in our heads. Alienated from the ability to turn our thoughts into reality. The only reality that matters, the one in our minds. Some people have special status in the world-building hierarchy, and they get to make their world our world. They get to make the thoughts in their head reality for us all. Their constructions are considered real, while others are not. This group, the people with special status and privilege, the world-building class, not only creates the world we all live in, they also create us. They use their constructions, their facts, their truths, their authority and legitimacy to manage your knowledge. To manage what you know and what you're capable of knowing. To manage who you see yourself as. In short, the world-building class uses their constructions to manage who you are. The world-building class determines your interpretation of yourself. They manage your identity. The world-building class creates you. You are the product of this world-building. You are made a product that stands as an alien power confronting your true self. The only way to escape this false reality and begin to construct yourself and your world authentically is to develop a critical consciousness. An elevated consciousness that understands this is how reality works. A consciousness that tells you that your consciousness is a social consciousness. Tells you that you are a species being, which means you are a collectivist that must build a perfected world in order for that world to condition and create a perfected human being. A perfectly creative and social human being. This is the same argument Marx made in his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. Your true creative and social nature is alienated from you. Your spiritual and mental labor, your ability to construct your world and yourself as a species being, as Marx described it, confronts you as an alien power. A power now owned and controlled by a privileged group of people that is wielding your world-building power against you. A group of privileged oppressors owns the means of producing society, and thus the means of producing man. You don't own the means of production. You don't own the means of your production, the production of yourself. So, we need a revolution to seize the means of production of society and thus ourselves. That's the critical constructivist program. That's the program we're going to talk a lot more about today. Chapter 2 of Kincheloe's book is going to sound a lot like Chapter 1, because once you understand the central argument that critical constructivism levels against the most basic aspects of what we call reality, everything that follows makes sense. Everything that follows begins to sound familiar. Okay, let's get into it. Quote, The key elements of a rigorous education involve understanding how our consciousness is constructed, subjectivity shaped, and identity produced. Here rests the theoretical key to critical constructivism, the role of power in these processes of self-production, and, in turn, epistemology and knowledge production." End quote. A rigorous education for Kincheloe has nothing to do with teaching kids to read, write, and do math. Nothing to do with rigorous instructions as you or I would define it. It has everything to do with learning how our consciousness is constructed as historical beings enmeshed in intersecting webs of power. Everything to do with learning how our subjectivity is shaped and our identity produced. Kincheloe is saying that the theoretical key to critical constructivism, the idea that unlocks the door to what he called dangerous, world-changing knowledge in the last chapter, is the belief that power conditions our consciousness and creates us. And the process of creating us, of shaping what our identities are, power also locks us into an epistemology, a way of viewing the world and producing knowledge. Power locks us into reading the world and coming to know the truth of that world in certain ways. And for Kincheloe and his woke comrades, the most powerful discourse to shape and create us in the last 400 years is the discourse surrounding the scientific method. Kincheloe thinks that the scientific method is just another way of knowing and being. You hear it described this way all of the time in the woke literature. We need other ways of knowing and being. We need to center other ways of knowing in the curriculum. You can't read an education paper today without running into that statement. I wonder why. Said simply, Kincheloe thinks that the scientific method, underpinned by a belief that humans have a rational capacity that, when combined with empirical observation, empowers them to reason their way to objective truth. Kincheloe thinks that the idea of that is just another social construct, just another thing made up by humans, another thing that some people invented so they could box out other ways of viewing the world, invented so they could convince everyone that society should be organized around those who have access to it as their special form of bourgeois private property, something to point to justify why they get to define what counts as science and truth, who counts as a knower of science and truth, who counts as an educated person or not. Marxism is the idea that the division of labor is the fall of man. It's the idea that some people created the idea of private property. That is, a group of people invented the very idea that property can be private rather than collective. Then, those people used that idea to take property for themselves, to make property that used to belong to the collective and steal it for themselves, all under the guise that private property is now a legitimate thing that certain people are justified in taking. In its modern form, Marxism argues that the bourgeoisie created the idea of private property as you and I understand it today and gave it to themselves. They then sold everyone on the idea that private property is a legitimate thing that they are justified in taking. Your labor should belong to you, but you work for wages for a capitalist class that created the idea of private property, gave it to themselves, and now use that private property as justification to stratify society between those who have access to private property and those who don't. Kincheloe is saying the same thing. Some people created the idea of the scientific method. They invented the idea that truth can be located in external reality. Created the idea that the truth, capital T truth, exists outside of our minds, outside of our collective consciousness. Not only that, these people created the idea that truth can only be located when using rationality, reason, and the scientific method that they created. Then, they used that idea to control what counts as science, control who gets a voice in developing scientific methods, control who can access science. Coming to know the truth used to be a collective, experiential, social and emotional, and especially spiritual process. A process of becoming, never settled. Now a group of people invented the idea that capital T truth exists and only they can access it. Only they have the right to map it, define it, hold it in their bag, and point to it as justification for telling everyone else how to be in the world. Hold it out as justification to stratify society between those who have access to the scientific method and therefore have access to certifying knowledge, and those who don't. Hold it out as justification to convince everyone who doesn't have access to certified truth that their place and lot in life is their own fault. If only they could be objective and educated. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This is how all woke argumentation works, and it works this way because critical constructivism is based in neo-Marxist critical theory. Neo-Marxist critical theory. The woke believe the scientific method is, quote, trapped in an epistemology that locates truth in external reality, end quote. The scientific method is thought of as, quote, an inner process conducted in the minds of autonomous, not collective, individuals. The thoughts, moods, understandings, and sensations of the individuals are separate from their histories and social contexts, end quote. In other words, the scientific method alienates people from their creative and social nature, alienates them from their critical consciousness, alienates them from their species being. The scientific method produces certified knowledge or certified truths that stand outside of culture, power, and discourse, becoming, quote, merely a body of finalized knowledge to be transferred to the minds of students, end quote. Kincheloe is saying that the truth isn't out there, and to act as if it is while hiding behind reason, rationality, and the scientific method is just another way the oppressive class deceive and subjugate the oppressed. Just another way to earn the consent of the subjugated by convincing everyone that the scientific method is the only way to become a knower of knowledge in the world. Convincing everyone that the scientific method is something we've discovered rather than created. Quote, the human mind is more than a repository of signifieds, a mirror of nature. A critical constructivist epistemology assumes that the mind creates rather than reflects, and the nature of this creation cannot be separated from the surrounding social world. End quote. Like we covered in the first chapter, the woke believe that we create the world in our mind. And I do mean our collective mind. The nature of this creation cannot be separated from the surrounding social world. Cannot be separated from other people's thoughts and constructions from entering my head and making me. Thus, the nature of education completely changes. We can't just teach kids facts or scientific methodology that equips all people with the ability to use their experience and rational faculties to reason their way to capital T truth. We must instead teach kids to interpret. And again, if you haven't listened to episode 1 of what I am now deeming the Kincheloe series, go listen to that and come back. We must instead teach kids to interpret how knowledge is produced by dominant groups, dominant cultures, to subjugate the oppressed and maintain or expand a social, cultural, political hierarchy of privilege. Quote, critical constructivist teachers conceive knowledge as culturally produced and recognize the need to construct their own criteria for evaluating its quality. This constructivist sense-making process is a means by which teachers can explain and introduce students to the social and physical world and help them build for themselves an epistemological infrastructure for interpreting the phenomena they confront. Thus, an educated person in this context begins to construct her own meaning-making structures, her own interpretive strategies, her own criteria for producing and consuming knowledge. End quote. Kids must be taught that truth is constructed, and some truth and knowledge is privileged over others to maintain the status quo of an unjust social order. The sense-making process kids must be taught is critical theory. Critical theory is the emancipatory epistemological infrastructure they must be taught to interpret the phenomena they confront. In other words, if kids are confronting something about race or racism, they must be taught how to practice critical race theory so they can interpret the relevant information in an emancipatory way, in a way that emancipates them from the dominant explanations of what race and racism are, emancipates them from the dominant narratives related to race and racism, emancipates them from a multifaceted and objective analysis, pushing them to see all things related to race or racism through the lens of systemic power. Or maybe it's sex and gender. Maybe kids must use their emancipatory epistemological infrastructure to distill all inequality between men and women down to systemic power. Why do women earn less than men on average? The patriarchy. It couldn't be that the analysis that produces the "women make 84 cents on the dollar" line is a fraudulent one that can be utterly dismantled by a bright sixth grader. It couldn't be that. It couldn't be that women only make 84 cents on the dollar when compared to men only when you take the median weekly earnings of all women divided by all men, without accounting for differences in hours worked, overtime pay, time off, parental leave, skills required, differences in career choices, personality trait distributions, and human nature. It certainly couldn't be that. The president and the vice president, all of the woke companies and woke media, all of our universities and the United Nations couldn't possibly fall for a single variable analysis like that without knowingly and purposely deceiving everyone. They couldn't fall for that when they produce hundreds of thousands of pages of analysis blaming racism on everything from people to birds to climate change. No way. No. Women make 84 cents on the dollar because of the patriarchy. And sex exists on a spectrum. And you can change your sex. An educated person in this context begins to construct her own meaning-making structures, her own interpretive strategies, her own criteria for producing and consuming knowledge. Duh. As Kincheloe states, quote, "The Cartesian, Newtonian, Baconian conception of truth and certainty is fundamentally questioned by the epistemology of critical constructivism. We can never apprehend the world in a true sense, apart from ourselves and our lives. Never. Limited in this way, we can see only what our mind allows. With this restriction, we are free to construct the world any way we desire." End quote. Can this get any clearer? As I said in the first podcast, the woke think they are world builders. World builders with an emancipatory source of authority, Kincheloe says. They think they must teach kids to be world builders too. World builders who feel that they have an emancipatory source of authority to rebuild our world according to their postmodern neo-Marxist faith. These woke educators want to develop a critical consciousness in kids, awaken them to a new faith, and teach them to practice a critical theory of constructivism so that those kids will then go out and build the new world order, the woke world order. Quote, "The Cartesian modernist view of the self cannot stand up to the epistemological assault of critical constructivism." End quote. This quote goes on, but I need to explain this. By the Cartesian modernist view of the self, Kincheloe is referring to René Descartes' contributions to modern philosophy. René Descartes is the guy who was responsible for the phrase cogito ergo sum, or as you've heard it before, I think, therefore I am. Descartes is widely considered to be the founder of modern philosophy, and what's important about his work here is that his arguments contributed to the modernist view, in conjunction with people like Newton and Bacon, that the subject can come to know an object that exists independently of our thoughts. The knower, meaning the subject, meaning us as conscious individuals, can come to know an object that exists in the world independently of our thoughts. Basically, the rock in my driveway exists regardless of the thoughts I have about it. The rock exists independently of my perception. It has a size, a shape, a weight. It has a color, various features, etc. My consciousness engages the rock. I can see it, touch it, study it. My mind processes the sensory information coming through my eyes, nose, ears, and nervous system, and I perceive an object that exists in the world. An object that exists outside of my consciousness that I can come to know. I am a subject, a knower, discovering an object, that which is known, and we are separate. When Kincheloe says the Cartesian modernist view of the self cannot stand up to the epistemological assault of critical constructivism, he's saying that the idea that I've just described, the subject and the object, knower and that which is known, cannot stand up to the assault of critical constructivism. In simple terms, he's saying the Cartesian, Newtonian, Baconian modernist view has been overwhelmed by the critical, postmodern, and post-structuralist view of the world and reality. Okay, I can continue quoting in full. Quote, "The Cartesian modernist view of the self cannot stand up to the epistemological assault of critical constructivism. Taking the concept of knower-known inseparability one more step, post-structuralist analysis examines the socially constructed dimensions of language and discursive practices." End quote. The subject and the object are inseparable. The knower and the known are inseparable. That's what Kincheloe is saying. The subject and the object are not distinct, not dualistic. They are tied together, inseparably so. The subject can't come to know an object that exists independently of it. The rock does not exist outside of my consciousness. I cannot come to know an independently existing rock in my driveway. The rock I know in my driveway is constructed in my mind, constructed in an inescapable interaction between my subjectivity and the object that's in my driveway. If I don't exist, the rock doesn't exist. An object may exist that other people can perceive, but the rock I would come to know in my driveway does not exist if I don't exist. I create the rock in my driveway. That's what Kincheloe is saying here. That's why the woke call themselves world builders. Their perception is reality. Their lived experience is the real world that they create. Furthermore, Kincheloe tells us that critical constructivists deploy post-structural criticism and analysis to determine how language and narratives, quote, grounded in power relations, covertly shape our perspectives and insidiously mold our constructions, end quote. In other words, privileged people construct language and police the way we talk about things, to convince everyone else to accept their constructions of the world. To convince everyone else that the rock in their driveway is the same rock that everyone else must see. To convince everyone that the rock the privileged people have constructed in their minds is an external object in the world. What does this mean? It means the privileged people with their special form of private property, scientific method, get to tell everyone what the rock is and how it must be perceived and understood, how it must be incorporated into one's consciousness, all while hiding behind the idea that the scientific method is objective, neutral, and value-free, simply a way of discovering external truth, discovering things that independently correspond to a reality outside of our minds, correspond to a reality that doesn't give a damn about your subjective experience or feelings. Privileged people are just using their status on top of a socio-cultural political hierarchy that they created and sustain to covertly shape our perspectives and insidiously mold our constructions, thus insidiously molding us, creating us. I stressed this point significantly in the first podcast of this series. The woke think they are creating man. They think they are becoming God. Go back and listen to that podcast if you're feeling somewhat lost about this point. I hope by now it's really starting to make sense. Critical constructivists are attempting to ruthlessly criticize all in existence so they can tear away the layers of the onion and reveal a perfected human being, an emancipated human being who has become God, who remembers, after becoming critically conscious, that they have been a world-building God all along. Kincheloe says that, quote, "The notion of the autonomous self, free from the contamination of the social, is dead." The notion of the autonomous self, free from the contamination of the social, is dead. Individualism is dead. The basis of the Enlightenment is dead. Liberalism is dead. That's what he's saying here. There is no I think anymore. There is only we think now. Why do you think the woke are always talking about solidarity? Why do you think they're always repeating the same cliches? Why do the people dominating the national discussions about race, racism, sex, and gender all sound the same? There is no I think, only we think. We aren't free until everyone is free. The issue isn't the issue is the revolution, because we are collectivists. Quote, "The notion of the autonomous self, free from the contamination of the social, is dead. As language-utilizing organisms, we cannot escape the effect of the ways discursive practices construct our ways of seeing ourselves and the world." End quote. The woke, if you haven't figured it out by now, are obsessed with language. Obsessed with controlling it because they think language literally creates the world. Language is a world builder's tool. They think privileged people imbue language with their perceptions, their values, their judgments, their constructions, thereby creating us. The woke think language creates our consciousness. It shapes our ways of seeing ourselves and the world, as Kincheloe says. Literally, language creates us and the world, so language must be controlled. They want to control how we talk about certain things, control what language means, control how we define this or that, because people like Kincheloe think if they can control language, then they can control the real power to build the new world. This is precisely why they are so vicious about the pronouns. So vicious about telling people what they can or can't talk about when it comes to race and racism. This is why they redefine words without telling you. 10 years ago, not a single person I knew was talking about equity. Now everyone I talk to thinks it just means equality, because the woke have convinced them that equity is just a more robust form of equality. Yeah, you're right. It's forced equality through radical redistribution. Remember, the basis for the Enlightenment and liberalism is dead. The basis for the Declaration of Independence in our constitutional republic is dead. People like Kincheloe think this way. If you're confused at all about why some words don't seem to mean what people say they mean anymore, this is why. If language is confusing for you nowadays, this is why. The woke don't think language corresponds to an external reality. It only exists in our heads, and I mean our heads. Again, first podcast, go listen to it. Language is completely made up, and not only that, it is a construction that is inseparably tied to the object which it attempts to know. This means that language is used to construct the only real world the woke care about, the world that exists in their heads. This is insane. This is insane. Look no further than DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Does anyone really think that DEI means what these people say it means anymore? We could talk about this topic for hours by itself, but it's important to know that the woke use language to manipulate, and they feel justified in doing so because the individual is dead. We think we're on the right side of history, a process that culminates in us becoming God. We will use language to construct a world where we come to remember ourselves as creator. Utter madness. Quote, in this context, we return to the importance of interpretation in critical constructivism. Indeed, the teaching of interpretation becomes a central focus of the critical constructivist curriculum. Idiosyncratic readings protect students from correct interpretations and fixed meanings, as they, in the process, gain practice in recognizing the ways dominant power is attempting to construct their consciousness. End quote. So the point of schooling, as we discussed in the first episode of this series, is to push kids to develop critical consciousness, to teach them how to interpret the world according to a critical theory of constructivism, according to an emancipatory worldview that teaches them how to recognize the way dominant power is attempting to construct their consciousness. Recognize how the oppressor has not only created the world they inhabit, but literally created their consciousness. Literally created them. Okay, well, to teach kids how to develop critical consciousness, the teacher herself must understand all of this. Must understand how the world is constructed, according to critical theory and postmodernism, of course. The teacher's job isn't to teach kids how to read or write. Their job is to create a curriculum and fashion teaching practices to teach kids how to read their world critically and write the new world they must create. This is a longer but important point. Quote, the critical constructivist curriculum, Kincheloe says, leaves us not with a sacred, never-changing set of truths, like learning about the discovery of the scientific method and what that method can teach us about reality, but with a tentative encounter with the collective consciousness. Critical constructivist curriculum leaves us not with a sacred, never-changing set of truths, but with a tentative encounter with the collective consciousness, and a lingering uncertainty about the language used in the process. End quote. The teacher's job is to offer a curriculum that incorporates the child into the collective and makes that child a collectivist. That's what this means. That's the goal. But teachers are themselves socially constructed, and they may or may not be intentionally or unintentionally supporting systems of oppression when teaching in their classrooms. Therefore, they must know what aspects of their identity, their racial identity, their gender identity, their class identity, etc., feed into or combat oppression in the classroom. Therefore, critical constructivists learn to understand the oppressive forces that shape them so that, especially in contemporary Western culture, Kincheloe says, they can become less self-absorbed and individually oriented. In this context, they situate themselves historically and socially. Sorry, there were quotes around that. Therefore, quote, critical constructivists learn to understand the oppressive forces that shape them, so that, especially in contemporary Western culture, they can become less self-absorbed and individually oriented. In this context, they situate themselves historically and socially. End quote. So teachers too must become collectivists. They must do so before they can teach their children to become collectivists. The teacher must know that she's white, and that this means she has access to a socio-cultural and political private property called whiteness that confers privilege upon her ways of knowing and being in the world. She must know she's cis-heterosexual, meaning she identifies with the sex she was assigned at birth and is married to a man. She has to know that she feeds into and therefore helps maintain and expand whiteness, and cis heterosexuality, to the exclusion of her students who may not have access to whiteness, who might be oppressed by whiteness in their lives, who might be excluded by cis heteronormativity in their lives. Are we beginning to get it? Quote, critical constructivists understand that thinking in new ways always necessitates personal transformation. If enough people think in new ways, social transformation is inevitable. End quote. The teacher must undergo a personal transformation, must herself develop a critical consciousness and awaken to the woke worldview. Or, as Paulo Freire states in his 1985 book, The Politics of Education, one of the two books that initially catapulted him to the Christ-like status he now has in our education schools, teachers must, quote, really experience their own Easter, that they die as elitists, so as to be resurrected on the side of the oppressed, that they be born again with the beings who were not allowed to be. End quote. The woke always speak of transformation. They speak of it explicitly in religious terms. If you see this word in your schools, just know that there is a near certain probability that it means precisely what people like Joe Kincheloe wanted to mean. Quote, social theorists have traditionally been guilty of not recognizing this ambiguity of consciousness construction, identity production, and social action. Not until the 1980s, with the influx of new theories of language analysis and cultural understanding, did scholars appreciate the way power was embedded in language and knowledge, and the implications of such inscriptions in the production of self. End quote. The new theories of language analysis and cultural understanding Joe is talking about here are postmodernism, post-structuralism, critical legal studies, critical race theory, queer theory, disability studies, fat studies, critical multiculturalism, post-colonial theory, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on and on and on. Critical constructivists draw on all of these theories simultaneously to inform how they interpret the world, to inform their analysis of power, to inform who they designate as an oppressor and who they designate as oppressed. They draw on all of these theories to inform their activism. Most importantly of all, critical constructivists draw on all of these postmodern neo-Marxist theories to teach teachers and children to construct their identities, to build their personal intersectional webs of oppression, to build their personal interlocking webs of oppression. These theories are all used to first convince teachers that they must ruthlessly critique their identities to figure out which aspects of their consciousness are oppressive or oppressed. Teachers must die and be reborn into critical consciousness, must die as individuals and be reborn into the collective. Then, these teachers can teach kids to do the same. Teach Jimmy that he isn't Jimmy. He's an able-bodied, Christian, white, cis heterosexual male. Teach Kelly that she's an able-bodied, neurodivergent, mixed-race, gender nonconforming person with a uterus. It's all plug and play. Categorizing children based on the intersectional analysis of oppression and then assigning them a weighted value in the revolution to come. It's child abuse. That's what it is. It's child abuse. Quote, in very specific terms, critical constructivism is profoundly concerned with the production of self in the context of the influence of power blocks in contemporary society. Such concerns reveal itself in a critical questioning of the social, cultural, political, economic, epistemological, and linguistic structures that shape human consciousness, as well as the historical contexts that give birth to those structures. Such modes of analysis help students and teachers explore the socio-historical and political dimensions of schooling, the kinds of meaning that are constructed in classrooms, and how these meanings are translated into student consciousness." End quote. Precisely what we just talked about. Rather than learning to read or write, children must learn to read and write their new world critically. They must understand the socio-historical and political dimensions that have created their consciousness, and thus privileged or subjugated their perspectives in the world. They can only do this if they are under the guidance of a teacher who has already undergone the transformational process, has already developed a new understanding of what it means to be human, has already died and been reborn, has already become a radical political agent prepared to brainwash kids into this Marxist faith. Quote, "The notion of selfhood and human being they pursue as a form of critical ontology. Critical ontology demands that teachers who research the worlds of students, schools, and communities also research themselves. In this context, teachers explore what it means to be human and to negotiate the social and ideological forces that shape their pedagogical consciousness. In light of a critical knowledge of power, critical constructivists pursue a key dimension of critical ontology, a mode of being that is aware of the way power shapes us, the way we see the world, and the ways we perceive our role as teachers and researchers. When teachers possess such understandings, they are better prepared to support or critique what schools are doing and the goals that they are promoting. Teachers then become political agents who research their own practices and their own beliefs." End quote. It doesn't get any clearer than that, folks. To be a teacher, you must use critical constructivism to tear apart your own life, to destroy the old you, the individual you, to kill the old you, and be reborn into your new faith. They must explore what it means to be human, which means they must adopt the idea that humans are creative and social, just like we discussed in episode 1 of this series, precisely what Karl Marx's entire program is based on. Then, once reborn in their new faith, in light of the critical knowledge of power and their social nature, teachers can teach kids how to undergo the same process and how to develop critical consciousness. They must do all of this as political agents in our schools. That's what Kincheloe is saying. If they can accomplish this, then they can, quote, "imagine what we might become by recovering and reinterpreting what we once were," end quote. We must remember that we are God. We are world builders. That's what he's saying. Quote, "While we might use this to change our conception of the world around us, we must see this change of conception, this change of mind, is only the first step in a set of actions designed to change reality." End quote. The first step is to change the mind, to develop critical consciousness, and the second step is to rebuild the new social order, to take actions designed to change reality, to begin doing activism. Quote, "When teachers understand these ontological dynamics and work toward the political goals they portend, they have laid the foundation on which other aspects of professional education can be constructed. They have signaled to those around them that social justice must be integrated into every aspect of education, even the construction of teacher selfhood. With this sense of agency, teachers are better prepared to sidestep technical rationalism and the forces of race, class, gender, and sexual oppression that constantly work to shape education in the U.S. End quote. So we have critically conscious political activists in schools teaching our children. They hide their religious program under the banner of social justice and use moral extortion to integrate their worldview and political practice into every aspect of education. Remember, this book was published in 2005. These ideas have been flying around in the academy for a very long time. Entire generations of teachers have themselves been brainwashed into critical consciousness, brainwashed to become critical constructivists. Now, of course, if you talk to teachers, you'll notice that many of them have no idea what the hell critical consciousness is. They certainly don't identify as critical constructivists. But they can tell you that they have white privilege. They can tell you their gender identity and pronouns. They can tell you that women make 84 cents on the dollar and systemic racism and white supremacy are America's biggest national security threat. They won't tell you that they are socially transitioning your kids in schools. I'll tell you that. They might not be able to technically describe what has happened to them, but the evidence is everywhere. They are critically conscious. They have awakened to their revolutionary consciousness and feel an emancipatory source of authority in their bones. I want to remind you that Isaac Gottesman, a Marxist educational scholar, wrote a very illuminating book in 2016 that explained the critical turn in education, i.e. the Marxist warpath through our educational infrastructure. Gottesman explained how Marxists captured the academy and started using it to solve the problem of reproduction, a problem that they had been working on for a century. The critical turn was a defining moment in education. I'll let Gottesman speak for himself. Quote, "The turn to critical Marxist thought is a defining moment in the past 40 years of educational scholarship, especially for educational scholars who identify as part of the political left. It introduced the ideas and vocabulary that continue to frame most conversations in the field about social justice, such as hegemony, ideology, consciousness, praxis, and most importantly, the word critical itself, which has become ubiquitous as a descriptor for left educational scholarship. Initially sequestered in curriculum studies and sociology of education, today, critical scholarship is frequently published in the journals of some of the field's most historically conservative areas, such as education administration and science education. The critical turn radicalized the field." End quote. Yeah, it sure did. As someone who has read every book, paper, and dissertation I can get my hands on, Gottesman is underselling how radicalized the field has become by orders of magnitude. Gottesman continues, quote, "Critical educational scholars now engage in a range of intellectual and political traditions that help us better understand culture and identity, gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity, constructions of ability, ecological crisis, and their myriad intersections. Critical scholarship has also radically altered the way we inquire, from the way we conceptualize our research to the way we gather and interpret evidence to support our claims." End quote. The teachers that are coming out of the education schools have been battered with a tsunami of critical brainwashing. Queer theory has been practiced on them. Critical race theory has been practiced on them. Post-colonial theory, disability studies, fat studies, etc., 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 have all been practiced on them. They can't tell you that they have critical consciousness, but they do know they are woke, and they think being woke makes them a good person, places them on the right side of history, which, by this point, I hope you're thinking about being on the right side of history in a whole new way. What Kincheloe is describing in 2005, teachers as critically conscious political agents, is no longer a fever dream. Look around you. We're living in a critically constructed world.